The television courtroom had never witnessed such pure, unfiltered greed disguised as maternal concern meeting its complete and utter destruction. Victoria Ashford, a 42-year-old woman who had perfected the art of exploiting grief for profit over 15 years and 4 marriages, sat in Judge Judy's courtroom wearing a $4,000 Chanel suit bought with money stolen from her dead predecessor's son. Her perfectly manicured hand rested on an expensive leather portfolio as she prepared to deliver the insult that would expose her as a professional con artist and send her to federal prison for 18 years. Across from her sat 19-year-old Marcus Ashford, clutching a folder containing his late mother's photographs and the evidence that would prove Victoria had stolen $340,000 from the trust fund his mother died trying to protect for him. What happened in the next 38 minutes would become one of the most viral courtroom moments in television history, shared over 67 million times across every social media platform imaginable, with the hashtag #ProtectGrievingFamilies trending for 8 consecutive days. But here's what makes this story absolutely devastating. Victoria didn't just lose her case or get embarrassed on national television. What Judge Judy did to her in those 38 minutes was so brutally thorough, so righteously furious, that it ended Victoria's entire criminal career, exposed a pattern of fraud spanning 4 marriages and over $1 million in theft, and resulted in FBI agents arresting her in handcuffs as she left the courtroom sobbing and screaming about how unfair everything was. Before we show you the exact moment when Victoria called Judge Judy a bitter old woman who doesn't understand modern families and triggered the most devastating family fraud exposure in courtroom history, you absolutely need to understand who these people really were and what brought them to this explosive confrontation that would destroy one woman's life while vindicating a grieving son who refused to let his dead mother's legacy be stolen by a predator. Because this wasn't just about one stolen inheritance or one disrespectful comment to a judge. This was about a calculated con artist who had spent 15 years targeting vulnerable widowers at grief support groups, marrying them within months of their wives' deaths, systematically stealing everything she could get her hands on, and then disappearing to find her next victim before anyone could hold her accountable. This was about a professional predator who had destroyed 4 families, stolen over $1 million, and left a trail of devastated children who watched helplessly as their deceased parents' legacies were plundered by a woman who used sympathy and manipulation as weapons. Hit that like button right now if you're ready to see a gold-digging stepmother get absolutely annihilated for trying to steal a dead woman's life insurance money from her teenage son. Make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications because what Judge Judy reveals about Victoria's criminal past will make your blood boil and prove that some people are pure evil wrapped in expensive clothes and fake tears. Victoria Ashford had spent 42 years learning that other people's pain was her opportunity for profit, and she had spent the last 15 years proving it by targeting 4 different grieving widowers and stealing over $1 million from their families. At 42 years old, she had perfected a system so efficient, so ruthlessly calculated, that she could identify a wealthy widower, infiltrate his life, marry him, steal everything possible, and exit with a substantial settlement all within 18 to 24 months. Her method was sickeningly simple and devastatingly effective. She would research obituaries and funeral announcements in wealthy neighborhoods, looking for men who had lost wives and had substantial estates worth targeting. She would show up at grief support groups and church communities where these vulnerable men sought comfort, presenting herself as a fellow griever who understood their pain through her own fictional loss. She would connect with them over shared suffering that she had never actually experienced, gain their trust when they were at their most vulnerable, and position herself as the answer to their loneliness and the solution to their overwhelming grief. What made Victoria truly dangerous wasn't just her complete lack of empathy or her willingness to exploit people at their lowest moments. It was her supernatural ability to become exactly what each target needed her to be, her meticulous attention to detail in researching their deceased wives so she could reference the right memories and say the right things, and her patience in playing the long game because she knew that grief made people desperate for connection and willing to ignore red flags they would normally catch immediately. Victoria's criminal career had begun 15 years ago with her first marriage to Robert Chen, a 58-year-old accountant whose wife had died of breast cancer, leaving him devastated and alone with an adult daughter who watched helplessly as Victoria moved in just 4 months after the funeral. That first marriage had been Victoria's learning experience, where she discovered that widowers were easy targets and that stealing from grieving families was surprisingly easy if you knew how to manipulate marital asset laws and move quickly before anyone realized what was happening. Victoria had walked away from that first marriage with $120,000 after convincing Robert that his late wife would want him to start fresh, selling family heirlooms and jewelry that had been in his wife's family for generations, pocketing the money, and then filing for divorce citing irreconcilable differences before his daughter could build a strong enough case against her. That first success had taught Victoria the formula she would refine over the next 3 marriages. Marriage number 2 to Thomas Harrison, a 61-year-old small business owner, had netted her $200,000 after she convinced him to add her to all his accounts, forged checks, sold his late wife's jewelry collection, and filed for divorce the moment his son started asking too many questions about missing money. Marriage number 3 to David Morrison had been her most ambitious attempt yet, targeting a 65-year-old retired executive with a $2.3 million estate, but his daughter Laura had been smarter than the previous victims and hired a private investigator who uncovered Victoria's pattern just in time. Victoria had still managed to flee with $180,000 before criminal charges could be filed, simply moving to a different state and using a different name variation to avoid prosecution. The pattern across all 3 marriages was identical and absolutely chilling. Victoria would meet her targets at grief support groups within 6 months of their wives' deaths when the men were at their most vulnerable and desperate for connection. She would present herself as understanding their pain through her own fabricated loss, creating an instant bond over shared suffering that never actually existed for her. She would move quickly, getting engaged within 6 months and married within a year before family members could properly vet her or before the fog of grief lifted enough for the widower to think clearly. Once married, Victoria would immediately begin phase 1 of her theft operation by convincing her new husband to add her to all bank accounts for convenience, suggesting they update wills to protect each other, and systematically isolating him from his late wife's family by claiming they made him live in the past and prevented him from healing. Phase 2 involved small thefts that wouldn't trigger immediate alarm, selling pieces of jewelry or family heirlooms under the guise of helping him move forward, taking money from joint accounts in amounts small enough to seem like normal spending, and building a financial cushion while planning her eventual exit. Phase 3 was the major theft operation where Victoria would target the largest assets she could access, whether that meant convincing her husband to refinance the house so she could pocket equity, transferring large sums to hidden accounts, or in the case of Richard Ashford, going after the $340,000 trust fund that belonged to his teenage son Marcus. What made Victoria's crimes particularly disgusting wasn't just the financial damage, though she had stolen over $600,000 across her first 3 marriages. It was the emotional and psychological destruction she left behind. 5 adult children had watched their grieving fathers be manipulated and stolen from during the period when they most needed support and protection. Families had been torn apart by Victoria's deliberate efforts to isolate her husbands from anyone who might see through her act. And precious items that connected these families to their deceased mothers and wives had been sold off and scattered to strangers while Victoria pocketed the money and moved on to her next victim without a moment of remorse or hesitation. Richard Ashford had seemed like Victoria's ultimate score when she identified him 18 months ago. A 52-year-old investment banker with a $4.2 million estate, recently widowed after his wife Catherine died of ovarian cancer, and so completely shattered by grief that he could barely function in his daily life. Richard's wife Catherine had been his college sweetheart, his partner for 28 years, the mother of their miracle son Marcus who was born after years of struggling with infertility. She had been a beloved high school English teacher who touched hundreds of students' lives, and her death after an 18-month battle with cancer had devastated both her husband and her 17-year-old son who spent every moment he wasn't in school sitting beside her hospital bed watching her deteriorate. In her final months, Catherine had done everything possible to prepare for the future she wouldn't be part of, setting up a trust fund with the $340,000 from her life insurance policy specifically designated for Marcus's education and early adult life. The trust was carefully structured with her sister Jennifer and Richard as co-trustees, with explicit instructions that the money was untouchable until Marcus turned 21 and was meant to cover his college expenses, living costs, and give him a foundation for starting his adult life. Catherine had died 3 days after Marcus's 17th birthday, leaving behind a husband who could barely function through his grief and a teenage son who tried to be strong while his own heart was completely shattered. For 8 months, Richard and Marcus had only each other, bonding over their shared loss, visiting Catherine's grave together every week, slowly and painfully trying to build a new normal around the gaping hole her absence had created in their lives. That's when Victoria Ashford entered their lives like a carefully planned invasion disguised as a blessing. She had identified Richard through her research of recent obituaries in wealthy neighborhoods, learned that he was an investment banker with substantial assets, and positioned herself at the upscale grief counseling center where she knew men with money went to process their loss. The first contact seemed accidental, a shared moment in the waiting room where Victoria offered sympathy and understanding, claiming she too had lost a spouse and knew the particular agony Richard was experiencing. Everything about her story was a lie, carefully crafted from research and previous cons, but Richard was too broken to see through the performance. Over the next 4 months, Victoria became exactly what Richard's shattered heart needed, cooking his favorite meals, listening to his stories about Catherine without seeming threatened, and even appearing kind to Marcus though the teenager noticed things his father was too grief-blind to see. Victoria asked too many questions about money and assets, went through Catherine's jewelry with an appraising eye rather than respectful sadness, and started redecorating the home Catherine had carefully chosen as though erasing her predecessor's existence. Marcus tried to warn his father, begged him to slow down when Richard announced after just 6 months that he was going to propose, but Victoria had already poisoned that well by convincing Richard that his son was trying to control him through guilt and prevent him from healing and moving forward with his life. They were married at a courthouse 8 months after Catherine's death, no family invited, no celebration of the union, just a legal transaction that gave Victoria access to everything she had been planning to steal. Within weeks of the marriage, Victoria began her systematic theft operation with the efficiency of someone who had done this 3 times before. She convinced Richard to add her to all bank accounts for convenience, suggested updating their wills to protect each other, and started creating conflict between Richard and Marcus to weaken their bond and make it easier to isolate her husband from anyone who might interfere with her plans. She sold Catherine's jewelry collection, worth $120,000, telling Richard it was too painful for him to see and claiming she had donated the money to cancer research when she actually kept every penny. She convinced Richard to refinance their house and pocketed $80,000 from the equity withdrawal by claiming it was for investments that never materialized. She systematically drained joint accounts in $2,000 to $5,000 increments that individually seemed reasonable but collectively represented $45,000 of theft. But Victoria's biggest target was always Marcus's trust fund, that $340,000 nest egg that Catherine had died trying to protect for her son's future. Victoria spent months poisoning Richard against Marcus, calling the boy ungrateful and lazy, suggesting he was wasting his potential, and finally convincing Richard to authorize a temporary loan of $125,000 from Marcus's trust for a fabricated family emergency involving Victoria's mother who had actually been dead for 10 years. Marcus discovered the theft when he turned 19 and applied for an apartment near Columbia University where he had earned a full scholarship, only to learn that his trust fund had been depleted by $125,000 without his knowledge or consent. The confrontation with Victoria revealed her true nature as she claimed the money had gone into an investment that went bad, but when Marcus investigated further with his Aunt Jennifer's help, they discovered that Victoria wasn't who she claimed to be at all. Jennifer hired an attorney and a private investigator who uncovered Victoria's real identity, her 3 previous marriages to widowers, and a pattern of theft spanning 15 years and over $600,000 stolen from grieving families. They found the smoking gun email Victoria had sent to a friend bragging about how the idiot father would sign anything she put in front of him and how she planned to take everything and disappear to Costa Rica within 6 months. Marcus filed a lawsuit to recover his stolen inheritance, and Victoria countersued for $50,000 claiming defamation, still confident that she could manipulate her way out of consequences the way she had 3 times before. What Victoria didn't know was that this case had landed on Judge Judy's desk with red flags everywhere, and Judge Judy had assigned her best investigator to conduct the kind of thorough background check that would expose every lie Victoria had ever told. Judge Judy Scheindlin had built her legendary reputation over 35 years on an unshakable foundation of being able to spot liars, manipulators, and con artists within 30 seconds of them opening their mouths. At 78 years old, after 25 years as a family court judge in Manhattan handling over 20,000 cases involving every type of human dysfunction imaginable, she had developed what colleagues called a supernatural ability to identify patterns of fraud and predatory behavior. When Marcus's case landed on her desk, every instinct she had developed over decades started screaming that this was bigger than one stolen trust fund. The timeline was too perfect, the stepmother's confidence too practiced, and the victim's evidence too detailed for this to be Victoria's first time destroying a grieving family. Judge Judy assigned her senior investigator to dig deeper than they had ever dug before, giving them 2 full weeks to uncover everything about Victoria Ashford's past, and what they found made Judge Judy's blood boil with righteous fury that would fuel the most devastating courtroom destruction of her entire career. The investigation revealed that Victoria Ashford had legally changed her name 3 times over 15 years, from Victoria Chin to Victoria Harrison to Victoria Morrison and finally to Victoria Ashford, with each name change coinciding with a new marriage to a recent widower she had targeted at grief support groups. Judge Judy's team contacted the adult children from all 3 previous marriages and heard identical stories of their grieving fathers being manipulated, family assets being stolen, and precious heirlooms being sold while Victoria played the role of loving wife before filing for divorce and disappearing with substantial settlements. They obtained bank records showing the $125,000 had gone directly from Marcus's trust fund into Victoria's personal account and then immediately transferred to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands with no investment and no intention of repayment. They found Victoria's private emails where she had bragged to friends about her income from targeting grieving widowers, calling them idiots who were so desperate for companionship they would sign anything, and discussing her exit strategy involving non-extradition countries. Most devastatingly, they discovered that Victoria's entire story about understanding Richard's grief was a complete fabrication because she had never lost a spouse or experienced any of the tragedies she claimed connected her to her victims. Judge Judy spent those 2 weeks building an airtight case that would expose Victoria not just as a thief but as a professional predator who had made a career out of exploiting human grief for profit, and she coordinated with the FBI to have agents present in the courtroom because the evidence suggested federal crimes that could send Victoria to prison for decades. The courtroom was packed with unusual tension on the day that would end Victoria's criminal career, with Marcus and his Aunt Jennifer sitting at the plaintiff's table clutching evidence binders while Victoria strutted in wearing her expensive designer outfit bought with stolen money, radiating the confidence of someone who had successfully conned her way out of consequences 3 times before. Judge Judy opened the proceedings with seemingly innocent questions about Victoria's background and how she met Richard, letting Victoria tell her rehearsed story about being a widow who found love again while Judge Judy's slight smile told experienced viewers that she was setting a trap. When Judge Judy asked about the family emergency that required borrowing from Marcus's trust fund, Victoria delivered her practiced lie about her mother needing surgery, not knowing that Judge Judy had her mother's death certificate from 10 years ago sitting in the folder on her bench. The first crack in Victoria's facade appeared when Judge Judy pressed for details about previous marriages and Victoria's face went white as she realized someone had actually investigated her past. Victoria tried to maintain control by getting aggressive, sighing dramatically at Judge Judy's questions and making condescending comments about how the judge didn't understand modern families or the complexities of step-parent relationships. The tension built through 30 minutes of questioning as Victoria's arrogance grew and Judge Judy's trap tightened, with every dismissive eye roll and disrespectful comment being catalogued by a legal mind that had been destroying entitled people since before Victoria was born. The nuclear moment came when Judge Judy revealed that Victoria's mother had died 10 years ago and there had been no medical emergency, causing Victoria to stand up and accuse Judge Judy of harassment and not understanding family dynamics. Victoria's voice rose to a shout as she pointed her finger at Judge Judy and delivered the insult that would seal her fate forever. "You know what your problem is, Judge. You're just a bitter old woman who can't stand to see people happy. You probably never had stepchildren so you don't understand the challenges. You sit up there in your position of power judging people, but you're just a miserable old lady who needs to retire." The courtroom went absolutely silent as Victoria continued her tirade, completely oblivious to the fact that she had just committed professional suicide on national television. Judge Judy slowly stood from her chair, something she rarely did during proceedings, and her voice dropped to that deadly calm tone that made seasoned attorneys break out in cold sweats. Miss Ashford, you've just made a catastrophic mistake. Let me tell you what I understand about families. I understand when a predator targets vulnerable people. I understand when someone uses grief as an opportunity to steal. And I understand when I'm looking at a professional con artist. What happened next was 40 minutes of the most brutal, precise, and absolutely devastating systematic destruction ever witnessed in a courtroom as Judge Judy opened her thick evidence folder and began exposing every lie Victoria had told over 15 years of criminal activity. She revealed Victoria's 3 previous marriages to widowers, reading the dates and settlement amounts with surgical precision while Victoria's face drained of all color and Richard sat in the audience realizing his entire marriage had been a calculated con. She showed bank records proving the stolen trust fund money went directly to Victoria's offshore account with no investment or intention of repayment. She read aloud the email where Victoria bragged about manipulating the idiot father and planning to disappear to Costa Rica once she had stolen enough money. She presented evidence that Victoria had sold Catherine's jewelry collection for $120,000 and kept every penny while telling Richard she had donated it to cancer research in his late wife's memory. Judge Judy revealed that Victoria had stolen over $1 million across 4 marriages, showed evidence of fake identity documents and research on non-extradition countries proving Victoria was planning to disappear within months, and then pointed to the FBI agent sitting in the back row who stood up as Victoria's face transformed into a mask of absolute horror. The courtroom erupted as Judge Judy explained that she had been coordinating with federal authorities throughout her investigation because Victoria's crimes crossed state lines and involved wire fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and conspiracy charges that were federal offenses carrying 15 to 20 years in prison. Victoria collapsed back into her chair hyperventilating and trying to speak but only managing strangled gasps as the reality of her situation finally penetrated her armor of arrogance. Judge Judy delivered her civil judgment with the cold satisfaction of justice perfectly served, ordering Victoria to pay Marcus $125,000 in restitution for the stolen trust fund, $120,000 for Catherine's jewelry, $50,000 in punitive damages, and $25,000 for emotional distress, totaling $320,000 due immediately from the offshore accounts that were being frozen as they spoke. She dismissed Victoria's countersuit with prejudice, ordered Victoria to have no contact with Richard or Marcus, and then delivered the bombshell that she was referring the case to federal prosecutors for criminal charges that would send Victoria to prison for decades. The most powerful moment came when Richard stood up in the audience and walked toward Marcus, falling to his knees in front of his son and sobbing apologies for failing him and failing Catherine's memory by being so blind to Victoria's manipulation. Marcus helped his father stand and they embraced while Jennifer joined them, 3 family members reunited after Victoria had tried to destroy their bonds, and Judge Judy watched with rare emotion showing on her face as she witnessed the healing that justice could bring. Victoria's final moments in the courtroom were captured on camera as FBI agents approached her at the defendant's table, placed her in handcuffs, and read her Miranda rights while she screamed that this was unfair and that Richard owed her for 18 months of her life. Judge Judy's final words to Victoria were delivered with devastating calm as she said that Victoria was going to federal prison and to get out of her courtroom, and the audience rose in a standing ovation as Victoria was escorted out in handcuffs still screaming about how everyone had destroyed her life. The footage went viral within hours of the episode airing, with the clip of Victoria calling Judge Judy a bitter old woman hitting 800,000 views in the first hour and 67 million views within 24 hours across every social media platform. The hashtag Gold Digger Exposed trended #1 worldwide as millions of viewers shared the video with comments about finally seeing a predator face real consequences for exploiting grieving families. The aftermath was swift and absolutely merciless for Victoria but redemptive and healing for her victims. Federal prosecutors filed 18 counts against Victoria including wire fraud, identity theft, money laundering, and conspiracy, with jurisdictions from her previous marriages reopening cases and filing additional state charges that meant she faced over 100 years in combined sentences. She accepted a plea deal of 18 years in federal prison to avoid trial, and having the Judge Judy footage played repeatedly for a jury, was required to forfeit all assets in her offshore accounts totaling $680,000, and that money was distributed among all her victims from 4 marriages. Marcus received full restitution plus additional money that brought his total to $365,000, more than his mother's original trust fund, and he used that money to complete his education at Columbia University, where he graduated summa cum laude before attending Yale Law School to become a prosecutor specializing in financial crimes against vulnerable people. Richard received full restitution for the money Victoria stole from him personally, went through intensive therapy to process how he had been manipulated during his grief, and rebuilt his relationship with Marcus into something stronger than it had been before Victoria's invasion. The case became a landmark moment that inspired 8 states to pass legislation making it easier to prosecute serial marriage fraudsters, led to the FBI creating a special task force for identifying grief predator patterns, and resulted in grief support organizations implementing predator awareness training and background check requirements to protect vulnerable widows and widowers from future Victorias. Judge Judy's handling of the case won an Emmy and became her second most watched episode ever, used in law schools and FBI training programs as the perfect example of thorough investigation exposing systematic fraud. Victoria Ashford is currently serving year 2 of her 18-year sentence in federal prison, working in the prison laundry for 12 cents per hour, isolated even among inmates who know her story and despise predators who exploit grief. She will be 60 years old when released with a permanent criminal record, no money, and a face that millions of people associate with the phrase grief predator thanks to footage that will exist on the internet forever. If you think Victoria got exactly what she deserved for stealing from a dead mother and calling Judge Judy a bitter old woman, smash that like button right now and comment "Protect families" to show you believe predators who target grieving people deserve harsh consequences. Hit subscribe so you never miss another moment where family destroyers face real accountability, and share this video with anyone who needs to understand that grief predators exist and justice will eventually catch them. Remember, in Judge Judy's courtroom and in life, those who exploit human suffering will be exposed and destroyed, and Victoria Ashford learned that lesson in the most public and devastating way possible.